Throughout its history, the United States has consistently pursued three interconnected interests with regard to Europe. Not to get involved in the conflicts of European powers, to prevent European powers from interfering in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, to maintain, or if need be, to restore the balance of power in Europe. These three interests serve the most elemental of the national interests of the United States: the security of the United States in the Western Hemisphere through the preservation of its unique position as a hegemonial power without rival. It was obvious from the outset that the privileged position of the United States in the Western Hemisphere could not be effectively challenged from within the hemisphere. It could only be so challenged from the outside. That is, if a European power were to make common cause with an American one, or to acquire territory in the Americas. Hence, the United States had to deprive the powers of Europe of both the incentive and the opportunity to challenge the United States in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine and the policies implementing it have served both purposes. Of the policies implementing the Monroe Doctrine, the support of the European balance of power has been the one requiring an active American foreign policy beyond the limits of the Western Hemisphere. It has been the purpose of that policy to prevent conditions in Europe from arising which would provide incentives for a European power to intervene in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, or to contemplate a direct attack upon the United States. Such conditions would be most likely to arise if a European power, its predominance unchallenged within Europe, looked across the ocean for new conquests without needing to fear a challenge at the centre of its power, that is, in Europe itself. It is for this reason that the United States has consistently, the War of 1812 is the sole major exception, pursued policies aimed at the maintenance, or, if need be, the restoration of the balance of power in Europe. It has opposed any European nation, be it Great Britain, France, Germany, or Russia, that seemed likely to gain ascendancy over its European competitors, and thereby jeopardize the hemispheric predominance, and eventually the very security of the United States. Conversely, it has supported whatever European nation appeared capable of restoring the balance of power by offering successful resistance to the would-be conqueror. While it is hard to imagine a greater contrast in ways of thinking about matters political than that between Alexander Hamilton and Woodrow Wilson in their concern for the maintenance of the balance of power in Europe, for whatever different reasons, they were one. It is with this concern that the United States has intervened in both world wars on the side of the initially weaker coalition, and has pursued European policies largely paralleling those of Great Britain. There is an apparent contradiction between the isolationism of Washington's farewell address and the abstentionism of the Monroe Doctrine, on the one hand, and the interventionism of our balance of power policies, on the other. This contradiction is logically resolved by the qualification implicit in the policies of isolationism and abstentionism. The farewell address warns against American implication, quote, in the ordinary vicissitudes of her, Europe's, politics, or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities, end quote, emphasis added. That is to say, the injunction against involvement was predicated upon the continuing operation of the European balance of power. It did not apply to quote-unquote extraordinary vicissitudes and quote-unquote extraordinary combinations and collisions. It did not apply to those fundamental conflicts which put into question the very existence of the European balance of power. This apparent contradiction has posed a practical issue for the conduct of American foreign policy. When was it necessary for the United States to intervene in order to maintain or restore the European balance of power? And when should the United States abstain because intervention would amount to meddling in quote-unquote ordinary conflicts, and would therefore not be justified by the American interest in the European balance of power? The issue became acute at the very beginning of American history, culminating in Washington's Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. It remained dormant until the First World War because there was no occasion for it to be raised. From 1917 onward, it has remained a constant concern of American foreign policy, and it has posed itself in the aftermath of the Second World War with unprecedented acuteness and radically modified under the impact of the new technologies of communication, transportation, and warfare. In 1793, Washington was urged by a preponderant public opinion to enter the War of the First Coalition on the side of France. This course of action was urged not in support of the European balance of power, but in terms of treaty commitments, moral obligations, and political ideology. Calculations of interests and power as presented by Hamilton in the Americanos and Pacificos articles carried the day against these arguments. Between April 22, 1793 and April 6, 1917, Europe did not present the United States with such a clear-cut choice between abstention and intervention, putting to the test of policy the American understanding of its interest in the European balance of power. And yet, during that long period of actual isolation, awareness of that vital interest remained alive in both theory and practice. Two historic episodes illuminate the point. The changes in Jefferson's preferences from Great Britain to France and back, according to the fortunes of the Napoleonic Wars during the concluding decade, and American diplomacy during the Crimean War. In 1806, Jefferson favoured, quote, an English ascendancy on the ocean as being safer for us than that of France, end quote. In 1807, he was forced by the logic of events to admit, quote, I never expected to be under the necessity of wishing success to Bonaparte, but the English being equally tyrannical at sea as he is on land, and that tyranny bearing on us in every point of either honour or interest, I say, down with England. And as for what Bonaparte is then to do to us, let us trust to the chapter of accidents. I cannot, with the Anglo men, prefer a certain present evil to a future hypothetical one. End quote. However, in 1812, when Napoleon was at the pinnacle of his power, Jefferson hoped for the restoration of the balance. Speaking of England, he said, quote, it is for the general interest that she should be a sensible and independent weight in the scale of nations, and be able to contribute, when a favourable moment presents itself, to reduce under the same order her great rival in flagitiousness. We especially ought to pray that the powers of Europe may be so poised and counterpoised among themselves that their own security may require the presence of all their forces at home, leaving the other quarters of the globe in undisturbed tranquillity. End quote. In 1814, again compelled by the logic of events, he came out clearly against Napoleon and in favour of a balance of power that would leave the power of Napoleon and of England limited, but intact. A long quote here. Surely none of us wish to see Bonaparte conquer Russia and lay thus at his feet the whole continent of Europe. This done, England would be but a breakfast, and although I am free from the visionary fears which the votaries of England have affected to entertain, because I believe he cannot effect the conquest of Europe, yet put all Europe into his hands, and he might spare such a force to be sent in British ships, as I would as lieve not have to encounter, when I see how much trouble a handful of British soldiers in Canada has given us. No, it cannot be to our interest that all Europe should be reduced to a single monarchy. The true line of interest for us is that Bonaparte should be able to effect a complete exclusion of England and from the whole continent of Europe in order, as may the same letter said, quote, by this peaceable engine of constraint to make her renounce her views of dominion over the ocean, of permitting no other nation to navigate it but with her license, and on tribute to her, and her aggressions on the persons of our citizens who may choose to exercise their right of passing over that element. End quote. And this would be effected by Bonaparte's succeeding so far as to close the Baltic against her. This success I wished him the last year, but were he again advanced to Moscow, I should again wish him such disasters as would prevent his reaching Petersburg. And were the consequences even to be the longer continuance of our war, I would rather meet them than see the whole force of Europe wielded by a single hand." End quote. Similarly, in 1815, Jefferson wrote, quote, "For my part, I wish that all nations may recover and retain their independence, that those which are overgrown may not advance beyond safe measures of power, that a salutary balance may be ever maintained among nations, and that our peace, commerce, and friendship may be sought and cultivated by all." End quote. The concrete issues of the Crimean War were of no concern to the United States, and thus the United States declared its neutrality in that war. Yet the United States was concerned with the preservation of the European balance of power, and its diplomacy reflected that concern. The Crimean War coincided with a particularly active phase of American expansionist agitation. Great Britain, France, and Spain tried to contain the territorial expansion of the United States. The United States had an interest in preventing the Anglo-French combination from surviving. The war and emerging from it with hegemonial power. Since Spain was too weak to contain the United States without Anglo-French support, the United States also had an interest in gaining advantages at the expense of Spain, as long as the war lasted. Thus it supported Russia against Great Britain and France, and it took advantage of the military preoccupation of the latter powers and the resulting isolation of Spain by exerting pressure upon Spain. As a contemporary writer, Francis E. Grund, put it, "If the map of Europe is to be changed, if Turkey is to be divided, and the nations of Europe are to extend their power and influence into Asia, we may consider how far this great historical movement of the people of the Old World may affect the conditions of the New, and what steps it may be prudent for us to take to balance the account. If it be contended that we must remain indifferent to the affairs of Europe, that the changes wrought in the institutions and mutual relations of European governments do not merit our consideration and challenge our watchfulness, then, assuredly, our neutrality doctrine would amount to an injunction on ourselves, and condemn us, in our foreign relations, to absolute political inaction. It would ensure all other nations against harm from our growing energy and power, while it would not protect us from their intermeddling with our affairs." End quote. The American intervention in the two world wars made explicit in terms of policy what, throughout American history, had been recognized in theory, and, however inconspicuously, translated into practice: the vital interest of the United States in the European balance of power. The official documents have made clear that Wilson was moved to intervene not only by his concern for the rights of neutrals, but also by the anticipation of the consequences of a German victory, as foreshadowed by the German policies immediately preceding the American declaration of war. Wilson's subsequent policy of peace without victory was similarly inspired by the rationale of the balance of power. Wilson went to war in order to prevent a German hegemony, while during the war and at the peace table he proclaimed as his purpose to put an end to the balance of power, he actually tried to prevent the hegemony of the Allies. Similarly, the United States intervened in the Second World War on the side of the Allies in order to prevent a German victory. From the very outset of hostilities in 1939, while remaining legally neutral, he took the side of Great Britain and France against Germany, the would-be hegemonial power, and took measures such as Lend-Lease, the destroyer deal, the defence of Iceland, the order of the Navy to shoot on sight, that were incompatible with the status of a neutral. When Germany's defeat appeared assured, the United States tried unsuccessfully at Yalta to prevent the expansion of Russian power into Eastern and Central Europe. After a period of fumbling and hesitation following the end of the European War, what Churchill called the deadly hiatus, the United States embarked from 1947 onward upon a consistent policy based on the balance of power. This policy differed radically from preceding ones. The rationale of preventing any European power or combination of powers from gaining a hegemonial position remained the same. Yet the policies serving this rationale had to be adapted to a new distribution of power and a new technology of war. At the beginning of each of the two world wars, the distribution of power, while it might have favoured one or the other side, did not make the victory of one side a foregone conclusion. Furthermore, neither side had at its disposal technological means for achieving a sudden victory, which would have been irremediable, or remediable only at prohibitive costs and risks for the United States. In both respects, the conditions prevailing in Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War were utterly different. With respect to the distribution of power in Europe, the Soviet Union had already become the hegemonial power. No counterweight existed in Europe that could stop the Red Army or prevent communist subversion on behalf of the Soviet Union, after the model of the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia in 1948. Furthermore, the Soviet Union had the quantitative and qualitative technological superiority in communication, transportation, and weaponry to make the submission of Western Europe an accomplished fact before the United States had the opportunity to intervene. Thus, the United States was then faced with the task not of maintaining an existing balance of power, or of shoring up one that was in danger of being disturbed, but of restoring a balance of power that was in acute disarray, and could not be restored from within Europe alone. In order to be able to support this balance, the United States had to become a European power by adding its resources in virtual permanence to those of the European nations threatened by Soviet hegemony. These were the factors of interest and power that led to the formation of the Atlantic Alliance. As concerns the political, military, and institutional arrangements within the alliance, one fact stood out in the aftermath of the Second World War: the great discrepancy between the resources of the United States and those of its European allies. For the latter, the political, military, and economic support of the United States was a matter not of choice, but of life or death. Without that support, the very survival of the nations of Western Europe as independent national entities would have been in jeopardy. The preponderance and elemental indispensability of American power put its stamp upon the policies and institutions of the Atlantic Alliance. This discrepancy between the power of the United States and of the Soviet Union on the one hand, and that of the nations of Western Europe on the other, caused the United States to view Western Europe as a whole, rather than, as it had been in the past, as a haphazard conglomeration of sovereign nation-states. In order to maximize the ability of the nations of Western Europe to provide a counterweight to Soviet power, the United States promoted the economic unification of Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, and supported the European communities and its military unification through NATO, while entertaining the hope that functional unification would culminate in political unity.